Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 137, reviews of Headspace, You Don't Say, Lost Property, and Vacancy.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, we're going to be looking at a few recent titles. First, we'll begin with Headspace, written by Ryan K. Lindsay, with art by Ed Zawadzki. Next, we're going to be looking at the new book from Nate Powell, a collection of his short stories from 2004 to 2013, You Don't Say. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with two small stories from Nobrow. This is part of their 17 by 23 series. Andy Poyiadgi's Lost Property and Jen Lee's Vacancy. But before we get to those, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are at 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find incredible specials. Now, sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes it's 50% off. But many times, those discounts go higher from there.
And we have at DCB Service for the month of May bundles of bundles. You can get, among other things, you can get a Marvel Kids bundle, a DC New Series bundle, a Vertigo bundle, and a Valiant bundle. All of those are 50% off.
That's right. It's Bundle Madness in May, and in fact, every month seems to be Bundle Madness at Discount Comic Book Service, and they have incredible specials in other places as well, and not just bundles. Go to their website and find out what those specials are for this month. That's dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, please do.
And in fact, Andy, we've made it easy for listeners to email the people at DCB Service. If they go to the website, they will see on our webpage a little icon of an envelope, which is interesting because you don't use envelopes for emails, but you'll get the message. You know, just click on that and your email software should automatically pop up and get you right to the email address of DCB Service. And we even fill in the subject line that says the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right. And it doesn't have to be anything elaborate, just a couple of words, you know, just tell them that you heard about them from us.
That's right.
We are also sponsored by Audible.com, who has more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. They are the leading audiobook publishers, and you can choose such comics-related titles as Sean Howe's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, Harry Broad's Superman is Jewish, Douglas Wolk's Comic-Con Strikes Again, and Lawrence Melson and Michael Cantor's Superheroes, Capes, Cowls, and the Creation of Comic Book Culture.
That's right. Get a free audiobook of your choice at www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative, and get started today. Well, Andy, before we get to the heart of our review episode this week, we have a few announcements, and they are all listener-based.
Oh, how about that? All right.
Yeah, first I want to thank, in a big way, our newest podcast supporter through Patreon, and this is Kathleen Ralph, and she is from Calgary up in Canada. And, you know, we've been doing a lot of Canadian comics lately, and I'm wondering if this has anything to do with Kathleen Ralph becoming a patron. And she has joined us at the $1 level. And, you know, over the past few months, more and more people have done this, signed up to support us on Patreon for just $1. And that's great because I have been saying that we'd like to see more of those. Just any amount helps. So, Kathleen, thank you for supporting us on Patreon.
Yeah, Kathleen, it really, really does help, and we appreciate your support and for listening to us faithfully. Thank you.
That's right. Well, Andy, there are other people who have been listening to us faithfully, and they have sent us mail over the past week.
All right.
Mail time. Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
The first letter is from Gary Haas. And Gary, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correct, is Haase. He is in Johannesburg, South Africa. And he writes, listening to your latest podcast, just thought of a sports comic, Southern Bastards. Football absolutely central to the story so far. Brutal toughness, fight nails it. Or no, brutal toughness, fight nails it. Recently picked up 2 of Enos's Vertigo War Story one-shots at Outer Limits in Melville, drawn by John Higgins and Dave Gibbons. They are poignant, perfect, and timeless. Oh, and thank you for the podcast. Signed, Gary. And what he's referring to is our on-location show for this month at Collected Comics and Games in Plano, Texas. And on that show, it was kind of an open topic episode where wherever the conversation went with customers, that's what the show ended up being. So we didn't have any predetermined theme. And at one point we were talking about genres that do not get much love today. For instance, the Western war stories as well. So that's why he was referring to Enos's war story series. We brought that up on the show. But the first reference is to another topic that we brought up about sports comics, and we don't have really much in the line of sports comics as a genre. And I think the one we brought up on the show was Vertigo's bringing back strange sports stories. I completely forgot about Southern Bastards, and Gary is right that you could read Southern Bastards as a at least participating within the sports genre. So, Gary, thanks a lot. You know, this is one of those few responses we get about our on-location shows, so I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, Gary, we do appreciate it, and I'm glad you reminded me of actually Southern Bastards is one of my favorite ongoing comics right now. I think those guys are really doing a great job with that. So I'm glad that you're enjoying that as well.
Mm-hmm. We also got an email from Matt Brower, and he writes about our episode from just a couple of weeks ago that Andy, you and I did, episode number 135. And he writes, I've just finished listening to episode 135, reviewing Exquisite Corpse, Operation Nemesis, and Palookaville number 22, and had a few small thoughts to share. First, as you said, I'm sure your listener writer wasn't disrespecting Andy Kunka in complimenting Derek and Andy Wolverton's chemistry. Remember that letter.
Yeah, I remember.
He says, but I thought I'd give Andy Kunka some credit where it's due because it was hearing him talk about Matt Kitts lighting books on fire at the 2014 Comics Illustration Animation Conference at Dartmouth that introduced me to the podcast. So that's cool. Yeah. He says, both the conference and the show have fostered my nascent love of comics and led me to great titles and creators. So if Kunka, you're listening to this, it is your comment about the fire in Kent that got Matt interested in the podcast. So that's a good job. Matt goes on to say, second, I was really surprised not to hear you discuss the surrealist technique, cadavre exeque, and I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly. For instance, where a series of people compose a sentence having only seen the word immediately previous to the one they add, or where a series of people make a drawing seeing only the last portion of what was drawn before, in your review of Exquisite Corpse. And as an aside, I did respond back to Matt about this. I really didn't see this as coming through in the book, but maybe it's there and I'm just not seeing it. So anyway, Matt writes, unless, of course, there was a spoiler. I hadn't read the book yet, but I saw it at my local store, realized it was a translation, and decided to seek out the original French, unsuccessfully so far. The reference seems deliberate in the title, so I was curious as to what role it might play in the book itself. I guess I'll have to be sure to read it sooner rather than later. And again, maybe there's something there, I'm just not sure. Finally, he goes on to write, without being too forward or impertinent, I wanted to offer my services as a reference for French name pronunciations. I'm a PhD student in French Francophone Studies and French language instructor at Northwestern and would be happy to pitch in. Not that you were too far off of Penelope Bagiou's tricky name, but I know like getting these things right and want people to correct me. The G is actually soft here, like Z in English Azure. So the pronunciation of something like, if you'll forgive my IPA, Bagiou, and he basically is spelling this out phonetically, the jus being one syllable, which is stressed, and the I, a semivowel like Y, making a diphthong, and the U being something between U and in English. Next time, maybe I should just leave a voice message. But, Matt, I definitely knew where you're going there. Anyways, I really enjoy the show, and I'm always learning new things from it. Whether it's about comics, literature, or 80s action movies. All the best, Matt Brower. And for listeners who may not have heard episode 135, we pronounced Bagiou's name Bagiou. So I know I was saying Penelope Bagiou, but Matt was giving us his vast knowledge of French pronunciation, and I appreciate that. It is Bagiou.
And you know, Derek, I think I just weaseled out and just let you pronounce all the names that I couldn't pronounce. So
yeah, I wasn't going to bring that up, but you're right, you did.
But no, Matt, we really appreciate that, and it's very helpful. And I'm glad that you are enjoying the podcast, especially that it is helping you discover new creators and new titles that you might not have experienced before. Because I think that's one of the things that I enjoy both as a participant in the podcast and a listener when I'm not participating, is to learn about things that I hadn't known about before. Mm-hmm. But you know, Derek, one thing I wanted to pick up on that Matt mentioned, and that's a very interesting thing, and that is reading comics in their original language. I don't know about you. This is something I've been thinking about a lot because I hear about international comics that really sound great and look great but have not yet been translated into English. And I haven't done it yet, but there are a few titles that I'm interested in, and I'm hesitating to buy them internationally, not because of money or anything like that, but because I'm not sure I would get the full impact. I mean, you could type things into Google Translate and that type of thing. But I would be interested to hear from listeners about whether or not they buy comics or graphic novels in a language other than their own.
Right, and if they also have read maybe the English translation, and they can do some kind of comparison contrast to tell us if you find the translation, is it as faithful as possible? I mean, obviously there's always something lost in translation, so to everybody uses that phrase a lot, but I mean there is, and so if a lot of that flavor or the essence is lost, then what does the translation do? So, I want to thank Matt and Gary for those emails, and we appreciate those. In fact, Matt's probably the most linguistically detailed email we've received. So, guys, keep them coming.
Yes.
So, you want to get into the reviews for this week?
Yeah, let's do that.
Our first book is Headspace, and this has just recently come out from IDW. It's written by Ryan K. Lindsay and with art by Eric Zawadzki. This originally appeared on Monkey Brain, the digital comics website, and I think it's an 8-issue series that the first issue of the digital comic was available in March 2014, and issue number 8 came out just last month in April of this year. So almost immediately after wrapping this up digitally, we have now a hard copy of Headspace from IDW. And before we get into the detail of this, I think it's worth pointing out that this is something that we find with a lot of Monkey Brain properties. Digital comics that originally started or were available on Monkey Brain and have been coming out in hard copy form collected from not only IDW, but other publishers as well. I know the main ones are IDW, Image, and Dark Horse. All 3 of those have done quite a number of hard copy collections of comics that originally appeared on Monkey Brain. So, and I find this fascinating. If that's a route that many creators are wanting to go, for instance, starting a comic, whether it be an ongoing or maybe just a limited series like Headspace, do it digitally, and then later on find a publisher like IDW who will come out with a hard copy, so you get the best of both worlds.
And I think, too, from doing the webcomics episodes that we do, Derek, we see a lot of that going on. We see a lot of digital or a lot of webcomics that are doing fairly successful, and then either they will get published self-published, or somebody will pick them up like IDW.
Yeah, exactly. But remember the distinctions that we've made between digital and webcomics, in that all webcomics are digital comics, but not all digital comics are webcomics.
Right.
So the difference with Monkey Brain is that those I do not consider webcomics, and you and I discussed this on our very first webcomics episode back in December, because they're not specific to the web, in that you could read them through a web browser, but you don't necessarily have to do so through a web browser. Because if you have, let's say, the Comixology app on your mobile device, you don't even need the World Wide Web to get it. You just go to the app, purchase it that way, and then read it, on your mobile device or even on your desktop. So, but I think you're right. The same thing that they're doing with Monkey Brain, you'll find with a lot of webcomic creators, is that they start off with the digital delivery system, where they don't have to worry about things like the cost of printing, distribution, and whatnot, which does shave a lot off of that initial cost, for the individual and also, of course, for publishers. But then once something becomes successful digitally, either as a webcomic or as a digital comic, then the print publishers may become interested, people like Image, IDW, and Dark Horse. So I think this is a great phenomenon. And we see this recently with Dark Horse. Remember, a few months ago, they mentioned that some of their titles, like Sundowners, I think is one, that had originally started off with the first 2 or 3 issues in hard copy, regular comic books, that they would suspend the hard copy issues and then come out with trade volumes that would be in hard copy, but from, after the 2nd or 3rd issue, they decided to take those titles and deliver and make them available only digitally. So maybe this is a more viable business model for comics, and we'll see more of this in the future.
Yeah, certainly possible.
But so we have something like that going on here with Headspace, originally appearing on Monkey Brain. But let's get into the details of this narrative. So let's try to wrap our brain space around Headspace.
Which is quite a challenge. Headspace starts out, I would say probably the first couple of pages are probably as normal as it's going to get. And in those first 2 or 3 pages, we see the first panel that we see of story is we see a woman whose hands are cuffed in police handcuffs. And we see a voice saying, "This is wrong, all of it, everything, it's all wrong." And the person who's saying that is a policeman named Gavin. And Gavin is speaking to his sheriff, and the sheriff's name is Shane. What they're doing, Shane wants to send this woman, this murderer, out away from the community of Carpenter Cove, where he's the sheriff. So he's sending her out in a boat by herself. And at the beginning, that's all we know. All we know is that he suspects or he thinks that she is a murderer. She's being sent out. And from there, again, that's the most normal part. There are some extremely strange things going on in Carpenter Cove, and the sheriff really doesn't know the half of it. Again, there's a lot going on, and this is not really spoiler territory because you can read this on the back cover of the book. But Carpenter Cove is a weird, weird town that is actually a construct in the mind of a killer. The entire town is the product of this killer's mind. And Shane, the sheriff, wants to try to solve these crimes that are going on, but he really, really wants to get back to his real life. So he's trying to solve some really strange things that, for all practical purpose, are the interior mind of a killer, while trying to do the right thing for his own personal satisfaction. This is a really, really strange story. It's one of those that you will need to read probably more than once. And, we've said this before on the podcast. It's not like rereading this comic is going to be a chore. It's fun. It is something of a puzzle, but it's extremely intriguing. Derek, what did you think?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you started off by referencing those first 2 or 3 pages, which seem to be quote-unquote normal, and then immediately after that we're plunged into a series of question marks. At least that's how I perceived it, because that is, I think, a good place for me to start understanding what's going on here. And you're right, those first 2 or 3 pages where you have this woman who's being sent out on a boat toward the horizon, there are all of these hints that something is off, but not too off. So in those first 3 pages, you do get a sense that Shane and what's the other officer's name? Gavin, yeah.
Gavin.
That Sean, yeah. And then this young woman, that they're part of some community, that this is not an ordinary community, that this is somewhere else. And after those first 3 pages, I immediately thought of 2 other narratives. I was thinking of The Truman Show, especially as that woman is being sent off in a boat toward the horizon. And I was also thinking about Lost, which, takes place on the island, and it just seemed like they're on some kind of island at first. But I thought, okay, this is unusual, but, not that whacked out. But then, once you get into the first few pages after that, where a character that we find out later, his name is Max, and this is actually the criminal whose mind that this setting is actually constructed in, but we don't know this at this point. He's running away from some men. He presses a button that makes a loud noise, and then we're back in this darker town setting with Shane, and we hear that sound, and people start falling from the sky. And then on that next page, he gets on what looks like a hovercraft / motorcycle of some sort, and there are dragons in the air. There's an ogre on the ground, and I'm going, okay, what the hell is going on here? I thought that it was unusual the first few pages, but this is just, wow. This is like some kind of acid trip. And I can tell you that it doesn't get any less crazy after this point. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. There are so many unexpected turns that this narrative takes that, you do see unusual characters. For instance, also in this first installment, or the first chapter, which was the first issue when it appeared on Monkey Brains, at one point, Shane goes into a bar, and of course the bar looks all dilapidated. In fact, a lot in this town Carpenter's Cove seems dilapidated. It tells you something about Max's state of mind, or at least what they're doing inside of his head. And at the bar is this dog-headed person robot. Okay, so the bartender has a man's body. It's got a dog's head, but there's part of the dog's face over his left eye that's torn away, and it looks almost something like the Terminator. You know, he has a little electronic eye with a red light in it, and so but you know, this dog bartender robot thing is talking as if, you know, nothing's unusual. So it's little surprises like this that work throughout, that really throw you off. And I think that one thing this title is great at doing is keeping the reader off balance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The total unpredictability of the book. You know, when you read something like this, or you see a movie that's just totally unpredictable, and you can't determine where it's going to go next, that can either isolate a reader or a viewer, or it can pull them in. I never felt like I was really isolated here. I was being pulled in. I never felt like I was not part of the creator's exclusive club, so to speak. I really was engaged in this, and I think one of the reasons is because the art is so effective. It's so strange, but we really do gravitate towards Shane and his problem. We want him to be able to solve these crimes that are going on in Carpenter's Cove, but there's also slowly revealed little bits of Shane's life, little bits of things that are happening here that affect him personally. And without getting into too much of that, we want to see him succeed on a justice level and on a personal level. Derek, you mentioned The Truman Show and Lost, and I think those are both really, really good comparisons. What it made me think of was the old television show The Prisoner. Okay. Because with that, you know, you've got so many bizarre things going on, and you're wondering, you know, was that real? What I saw, was it real, or was it something that was manufactured in the mind of I can't even remember the main character of The Prisoner now, but in his mind. And in some ways, Headspace is like that. It's just so out there, and it's so unpredictable, but yet the things that come up make a sort of sense within that world. And again, without giving too much away, I think the creators are able to create something that does make sense within the confines of something that doesn't make sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you're right. With a title like this, the tricky part is discussing it without giving anything away. And I'm glad you did point out that, I mean, the story setting is the inside of Max's head, and not just what this guy has going on, you know, whether he's crazy or not, but it's what the authorities have been doing in manipulating his brain, his mind, because that's the world that we get. Because we can't help but wonder, the more we get into the story, if this is so much Max's demented brain and the way that he thinks and works and behaves, or if the way that the Carpenter Cove setting is completely, you know, run down, off base, and whacked out, if this is something that the authorities are doing. But as we get into the second chapter and then the third, we find out more that this also has a large component revolving around Shane and his son and his search for not so much the son, but to understand what happened with the son. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think it's given anything away to say that his son is dead, because we learned this early on. He sees an image of his son and he wonders, how can this be? Because my son's not alive. But we start learning more and more about this. And so this becomes not only Max's attempt to get away or get out from the control of the authorities, but I think maybe even more so Shane's attempt to come to grips with the death of his own son and get back to a normal life in both the metaphorical and literal sense, to get out from inside of Max's head, back into the world that, the day-to-day world that, most of us, I think, can empathize with. At least I hope. But now in the second chapter, we're introduced to another character, and I was trying to remember his name, and I didn't write it down. The doctor, the one with the round glasses.
Yeah, I don't think I wrote his name down either.
And I'm sure at some point his name comes up. I just am forgetting it. But he's someone who, as a character, allows us quite a bit of backstory, because his interactions with Shane lets us know a little bit more about being inside of Max's head, and what all had been going on and why things are the way that they are. So I think that he serves that narrative function. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is, and this is beginning in the third chapter, or what would have been the third issue of the original digital comic. We get this chapter begins with Max, and he is in the home of a woman with kids, and he's talking with her in the kitchen. You know what I'm referring to?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a different artist?
Well, I think
Zawadzki, or is it Zawadzki illustrating in a perceptibly and purposely different manner?
It could be. Now, I know there's another artist connected to this, and it's
Sebastian Perez.
Sebastian Perez is credited with Zawadzki as an illustrator.
So now, that may be his art.
It could be, because it doesn't look like it was a collaborative effort, but possibly maybe he did that chapter or parts of that chapter, because the art style definitely is different from the first two chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And but I think that it's a different art style and a different artist for a reason.
Right. Exactly.
Because at the beginning, when we see Perez's art appear not often, but about maybe a total of 3 places tops, if I remember correctly, in this story. The first instance is the beginning of the aforementioned third chapter. And here is where we have the character Max Johnson looking quite different, again, a different art style. And he's interacting in what seems like a different world. Is this? I don't know. It just seems like a different realm than the one that Zawadzki had been illustrating.
Well, yeah, and I think maybe one of the things that might clear this up for the listeners is we do have, in those first 2 issues, this is mainly from Shane's point of view. And then we get several, like you mentioned, Derek, in that third, what we would call the third issue, we have several pages that are from Max's point of view, or either Max's point of view or some representation of Max's memory. Mm-hmm. That point of view. That's one of the things that we don't want to get into too much, because we probably learn as much about Max and what he has done, and maybe even what has been done to him. Again, without giving too many things away, but I think you're right, Derek, that a lot of that is reflected in the art style, and I don't think I probably picked up on enough of that the first time through. And again, this is all the more reason to have multiple readings of this, because I think there are a lot of great things going on there, and having to do with the art style as well.
Yeah, and you're right. In fact, this I looked at the other instances of Peru. What's the artist's name? I'm sorry, I forgot. Sebastian
Perez.
I looked at other examples of Perez's, what I guess is Perez's art, toward the end of the book, and there are a couple of instances of this. And yeah, you're right. It is from Max's perspective, and this is where, and I'm not giving anything away here, where Max is confronting a character by the name of Zara Blackwell. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason why he's specifically trying to track her down, because she has something to do, I won't say what, something to do with the fact that we're inside of Max's head. And so he tracks her down in her home, and it's about what he does to her at her home. And so those are the instances where we do have Parise's art, and you're right, it is from Max's perspective, which is really different. As soon as we shift back to Shane's, we're back with Zawadzki.
Mm-hmm. Derek, one of the things that I really liked was there are a couple of scenes with this man that I call the librarian. I don't think he was ever named, but the librarian is sort of trying to help Shane navigate what's going on in Max's brain. And there's a really great scene where he's showing him parts of Max's brain and parts of his thoughts. And in one of those scenes, Max is having an argument with a woman. And Shane says to the librarian, "Can't we save her?" And the librarian says, "There's nothing here to do. They're just surface memories." And on the next page, which is just a brilliantly conceived and executed look at Max's brain, the librarian is taking Shane through what, if we didn't know any better, we would just think are rooms of a house. And in each room, there's a different memory. And in some of these, Shane is actively involved, and some of them he's not in at all. And some of them he's an observer. It's just a really, really great visual of trying to represent what's going on in one person's mind, and that multiple things can be going on at the same time. And that has such implications, such profound implications for the story.
Yeah, and you're right. In fact, you're the librarian. In fact, that's I guess what we should call him. I referred to him earlier as a doctor of some sort, not necessarily a medical doctor, but he has that professorial look to him. But you're right. This is the same individual. So he is the one who you're describing here, and that is a great scene. And it's maybe about halfway through, a little more than halfway through the book, where he is walking through the landscape of Max's mind, which is set up like a series of rooms in this larger building. It almost reminds me of the game Clue. As they're walking through, and something strange is going on in each of these rooms. A woman is holding a gun toward Max in one. There's blood splatter in another. There looks like some kind of creature from the Black Lagoon swimming in a room filled with water in another room. Shane is fighting dogs in another one. It is strange. And all of these are compartments, apparently, of Max's mind. And it does add to the strangeness of this narrative.
And, too, one of the things I think that makes this refreshing is the characters are often surprised at what's going on at the same time we are. In fact, right after that scene where the librarian takes Shane through those rooms of Max's mind, he comes to a room and says, "This whole place has changed. Those rooms weren't there before." So, and that's a part of connecting us to the story. It would be different if all of the characters just assumed, "Oh, this is just business as usual," and we're on the outside. This makes us more of a part of the story element, since in some cases they don't even know as much as we do.
Right, exactly. Now, I would not call this a cinematic comic, but it is a story that has a lot of potential for, if not the cinema, then at least the small screen. I mean, I could see this being made into either a movie or a television show or a series, and it would be intriguing. And I can imagine what you can do with special effects in this story. And I was thinking about this in the panel that you just quoted, where they're walking, that one scene where they're walking through the mind, which is a series of rooms, and the librarian says, "Oh, this whole place has changed. Those rooms weren't there before." I mean, I can imagine what a special effects person can do with this, and who knows if this will be picked up, but it just has a lot of potential. But getting back to the medium of comics, I do think that this works well within comics as well.
Yeah, there are so many. I think there are so many good decisions being made about structure and panel layout, and again, as you mentioned too, having two different artists. Not that it would probably be a fine comic if it had been one artist throughout, but I think this having another artist adds a lot of richness and depth to it that you could not have had with one single artist. If I would tell listeners, if you are in the mood for something very unusual, this would definitely be the book for you. And the great thing about it is it's all self-contained. You don't have to worry about another volume coming out. I guess that's good and bad, that there's not another volume. But if you enjoy things that are challenging, comics that are challenging and intriguing, I think you're going to enjoy Headspace.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we should tell listeners that this book is filled with a lot of violence. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a little squeamish about having heads lopped off, a lot of blood, violent actions of a variety of different sorts, and I'm saying this because I'm looking at one of the very last pages of, I think it's chapter 6, and this is where Shane comes up against Max, and they're on the water. And, of course, at this point, Shane thinks that he's going to get out of this thing, right? So he's heading to the horizon in a boat, which brings us back to the very beginning, which is what he did with that one woman who committed a murder. Right. And as they're on the water, we see Shane on a boat, and as part of this boat are just a series of dead bodies that look barbed wire to the hull. And in fact, we even see the decapitated head of the librarian on top. But this doesn't necessarily spoil anything, because you will find characters in this story that are killed and then seem to come back. Because, again, we're inside somebody's head, and it's not just that. It's somebody's head that's being manipulated. So reality can come and go and can morph in a variety of different ways. But anyway, I mention all this because it can get rather violent. And I think that this is the kind of story that it makes sense that this is violent, because we're inside the head of a violent person.
Right. And, we all think things that we would maybe not carry out physically, but they may be in our minds. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's one of the most terrifying aspects of the book.
So, Andy, you want to move on to the next title that we're going to be discussing this week?
Yes, this one is quite a bit different from Headspace.
Yep. It is You Don't Say, short stories 2004 through 2013 by Nate Powell. And this is published by Top Shelf. And Top Shelf has been Nate Powell's publisher, not his only publisher, but I think his main publisher over the past several years. Mm-hmm. If you're not familiar with Nate Powell's work, then you probably have not read the 2 March books, the John Lewis books. And, in fact, Nate Powell is the artist in those. He also is the artist of a book that came out in, I think it was 2012, The Silence of Our Friends, which is a great story. And he is also the author of Swallow Me Whole, which won both an Ignatz and an Eisner Award, and Any Empire, which came out, I think, right after or soon after Swallow Me Whole. So outside of March, Andy, had you read any Nate Powell before this?
I've picked up Any Empire before at the library. I think we have it there, but I did not read it. But I typically check out like a dozen or so graphic novels, and some of them don't get read. And I think that was one of them. So, no, the only thing that I have read is March. Although I did meet Nate Powell at the Small Press Expo last year, and we had a really nice discussion, really nice guy. And we both share Southern roots, which come into play in this collection. Mm-hmm. So, so I'm somewhat familiar with his work, and I definitely want to read more.
Yeah, and the reason I ask about the other works of Nate Powell is to get, as a way into the stories collected in You Don't Say, if you look at an artist's body of work, and not just in comics, but literature, painting, music, or what have you, if you look at the larger sweep of things, like you say, look at their earliest stuff and where they are now, and if you can find certain characteristics, it could be characteristics of writing style or the use of certain images or larger themes, themes or the ways that they tell a story, if you can pick out certain commonalities among the various pieces in their body of work, then I think you've come a long way in trying to capture, or at least to try to define, an artist's style in the larger sense of the word. And a couple of things that stand out to me about Nate Powell's work is, you mentioned the South. A lot of his comics, whether those that he's written himself and also illustrated, or what he's illustrated with other writers, I think March being probably the best, most notable example of that, have a lot to do with race relations, especially as it applies to the South. The Silence of Our Friends, which is actually a line from a speech of Martin Luther King, or some writing to Martin Luther King, has everything to do with race. In Houston is where the story takes place. Same thing with March, and also a lot of the stories that we have in You Don't Say. And I think a lot of this comes back to his roots in being from the South. He's, I think, originally from Little Rock, right?
Yes.
And, I guess you consider that the South. I guess I consider it the South. See, I'm like you, I'm a Southerner. I'm from North Carolina, and that's a different kind of South from what I am used to. Another aspect of Nate Powell's work that I see, if I look at a lot of the things that he's written, is many times his narratives have a dreamy quality to them. And I don't mean dreamy in a sentimental or frou-frou way, but that sometimes events from one page to the next, many times from one panel to the next, don't seem as coherently connected. In other words, it's not as linear. There's something that may happen in one panel or page, and then at times you're a little challenged to make sense of what happens in the next panel or page. And I think you find that quite a bit in, not so much the March books, but I think definitely in Any Empire and then Swallow Me Whole. And in fact, Swallow Me Whole, the one that won him the Eisner and Ignatz Awards, is in many ways about schizophrenia, or at least some kind of mental disorder, or at least some kind of state of mind, and growing up especially. So things may not follow logically and coherently one event to the next. And I think you find some of that going on as well in You Don't Say, where some of the stories seem to be a little ethereal in a way, in that there's not that kind of clear sequentiality. This happened, then this happened, the next thing happened, and then the final thing happened. It's just there and it evolves, and then many times some of these stories just end without resolution, and that's fine. But I think that's one of the characteristics I've seen of Powell's work.
I think so too, and I think especially in these early stories, and although we see it in some others too, is just even in the way that Powell uses word balloons. They're kind of twisty. They're almost these, they have kind of a gossamer quality to them. They're kind of ethereal in some ways, like you mentioned, and they do tend to reflect a lot of the interior thoughts of the character, and especially in these first 4 or 5 stories, it seems like these are very, very autobiographical stories. And in fact, the main character in most of them, I believe, is called Nate. So he's really writing about himself to some degree. But, these, when I was first reading through this, I thought that the first 4 stories, they're not really what you would call plot driven, but they're just kind of his way of expressing himself. And I want to say this is fairly early in his career. I read an interview with Powell where he's talking to Comic Book Resources, and he likened these early stories to kind of he called them naked baby photos, like those pictures our parents take of us when we're a kid, and there they are. I mean, what can you do? So it seemed like to him these early stories are kind of his naked baby photos. But you can see the development of an artist. And although these stories are not in quite the same style that we see in March, in a way they are, and you can see that artist, how he's developed, and that this is a very honest and open look at what his life was like in these early stages of his career.
Exactly, and that's one of the benefits of a book like You Don't Say that collects a lot of shorter pieces from an artist's career early on up to something much more recently. The most recent one came out in 2013. And you're right about those initial stories. And in fact, the first four, The Phantom Form, The Old Haunts, Work at It, and Seriously, Powell tells us that these were all collected in a very early book of his that came out from Top Shelf. It may be his first Top Shelf book, Please Release. Now, I have not read that one. Have you?
No, I had not. And it seems like, is everything that was collected in this, or most of it?
I don't know how many stories, again, because I have not seen Please Release, so maybe our listeners who are much more up on Nate Powell's early work than we are can let us know, and we can get more listener mail. But we have 4 small stories that were a part of Please Release. And as Nate Powell tells us at the introduction of this first one, The Phantom Form, is that we should read these together. Not only because they all appeared in Release Me, but you're dealing with, as you pointed out, the same protagonist, a young boy or a young adult named Nate, and we see him in different parts of his life, or at least his early life, at work, with friends, and what have you. So I think they do work really well together. Now, getting back to what I said earlier that he provides us, Powell does, with introductions to these, I really appreciated that. He gives us, I don't think it's an obtrusive authorial intrusion into this collection of stories. He gives us some context. So he tells us not only where they originally appeared, and in fact, it's only, I think, the final story, Havens Have Not, that has not yet been published before this book came out. But it's the only unpublished story in this collection. But he tells us where the others appeared, when, if he had a collaborator, let's say he was the artist and someone else did the writing. And he also gives us a little context about maybe where he was in his life at this point, or what he remembers about the writing experience of this particular story. And I appreciate that. It's just enough information to give us something to go on, but it's not so much that we have an artist who is going back through his old work and saying, well, let me kind of ask for your apology ahead of time for this, because
right.
He doesn't excuse the stuff, even though he may not see it as his strongest work. I think he gives just enough context for me to appreciate these pieces even more.
I agree, and like you said, it's not obtrusive at all, and he doesn't give us too much information, and I really appreciate that he doesn't, like you said, back up and say, oh boy, look at what I used to draw like, oh, wasn't this a terrible thing? He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't dwell on things that we're not concerned with. He really does give us just enough of himself, not only in the stories that he's written and drawn, but enough of his background just to give us a taste of what he was going through. And I think we see that right off the bat at the first story, where Nate as a character is leaving a facility where he has worked with people with developmental needs, and he is constantly moving from job to job, and there's this feeling of insecurity. I mean, he's done good work, and there's one of the quotes in there that Nate says, I'm terrified of existing and even more afraid of being forgotten. So you can see even in this very first story that there's this huge inner conflict about wanting to do the right thing and then needing to do something, maybe something else somewhere else. And the way that he is honest with us is honest in itself, because we can read stories about people's past or things they've been through, and sometimes they just don't ring true, or they're trying to paint themselves in a light that makes them look better. Powell's not about that. I mean, I think he's really just laying it out here and just saying, this is who I was at the time, this is what I was going through at the time, and this is how this helped me become a comics creator. And for that, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I see in You Don't Say, the various stories, is that most, not all, but most of them have young protagonists, either young protagonists in junior high or high school, maybe college age or right after college. And my guess is that for the most part they reflect where Nate was, or at least what he could relate to at that point in his life. Although there are a couple of stories, though, that deal with more mature characters. For instance, one is Unchained, and this is, I think, the second to the last one or the third to the last story, and it deals with older, maybe middle-aged characters. But for the most part, I think the protagonists are younger.
Mm-hmm. I think they are too, and especially some of these early stories have a punk rock element to them.
Right.
That deal with either being in a punk band or being part of the punk scene, which I didn't really know anything about that part about Nate Powell. But so some of those do have a more autobiographical slant than others. And like you said, Derek, most of them I think are about people that are fairly young, in their 20s. But some of them are quite different.
Right. And, whether they are very young or not so young, I think almost all of these stories have in common some kind of event or coming of age or a character coming to realize something or something happening to that character that you just assume is going to impact them for the rest of their lives, or at least be significant in some way. I don't want to suggest that every single one of these stories is about a turning point in someone's life, but there are a number of events that I think could qualify for potential turning pointdom, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Now, we have 17 stories in this collection, and again, they span from as early as being published in 2004 all the way up to 2013. Do you have a favorite one or two, or let's say a couple that stood out to you?
I do, and after while I appreciated the first few stories that were more autobiographical, I enjoyed those, but the ones beyond that, boy, some of them just really took off for me. I think the favorite one of mine was one called The Villa at the End of the Road. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that was one of your favorites, Derek, but this is such a creepy story. This could easily fit into a horror anthology. The setup for this story is half of this cliffside house has fallen into the sea, and the other half remains intact. And a woman is returning to this house, which is her former home, to pick up some of her mother's belongings while her 6-year-old son waits in the car. And I'm not going to tell you any more about that, but that was so creepy on so many different levels. Again, this is one of the best horror stories that I've read in a long time. I would put it in any horror anthology.
Yeah, you're right. It actually is one of my 2 or 3 favorite pieces in this collection. And Powell, in his intro to this is what I mean by very good context that helps us appreciate the story even more. He does give us the setup for this. He said that this story came about because one of his French publishers was having a 10-year anniversary anthology, and what they did was they gave their contributors a setup, okay? And that setup is that half of a nice little cliffside house is falling into the sea. Its remaining half has become a tourist attraction for curious boaters. The house's contents are naked to all. A lone neighbor watches as a woman returns to the house, her former home, for the first time since her youth, as her 6-year-old son sleeps in their car up the road. Now, that's the context he was given. That's what the French publisher said. Mm-hmm. This is the setup. Run with it. And the way that he ran with it, you're right, has a horrific feel, especially in the final 1 or 2 pages. And you don't really feel that, I didn't think, early in the story until we get to those last 1 or 2 pages, and then it does take a sinister turn. But I would guess that in this anthology, not all of the translations, so to speak, of that setup would be horrific. I mean, there could be some that are comedy, some straight drama. I mean, they could go any number of directions from that premise. So yeah. I think that it's a great exercise to be given a premise and then go with that. And you're right, this does start innocently enough, even though that neighbor does look a little creepy with that big full beard. But it does take a dark, sinister turn in the final pages.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, it's a real it's one of those stories that will stay with you for a while.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorites is actually one that he didn't write. This is written by Rachel Borman, came out in 2008, and he said that this was self-published. This is Cakewalk.
Yeah, that's one of mine too.
And the thing I love about Cakewalk, well, first off, the premise is that we have a character here, and what is her name?
Sarah.
Sarah. Okay, we have Sarah. And in fact, Nate in his setup tells us that this is the same type of character that we find in not only Swallow Me Whole, which is, his earlier graphic novel, but also we find some form of this character a little older in a story collected here called The Uncomfortable Gaze of Carlos Santana, which is kind of a freaky story. But anyway, here we have a younger Sarah, and it's, I guess, Halloween, and the kids are going to school dressed as a character. Well, one of the things that Sarah wants to do is to do something different. She doesn't want to wear a Halloween costume like everyone else is, dressed as a princess, dressed as a monster or something, or, some of the kids are dressed as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. She comes dressed as all things Aunt Jemima. Mm-hmm. And so she comes to school in the handkerchief on her head, what looks like a maid's outfit with that collar, and of course in blackface. And what she does, as we find out later, is to take charcoal and to rub it on her face, and that becomes almost a chore, as we find out later in the story. But she does this in order to get the full effect of being Aunt Jemima. And to me, one of the most powerful parts of this story is the fact that, or at least the way I read it, that Sarah is unaware of what she's doing as a racist act. In fact, it even raises the question, if she's unaware that this is demeaning in terms of African Americans, then does this become a racist act? Is it something that, if she didn't intend for it to be racist, do we see it more innocently or not? If you look at it another way, she's growing up in this southern, atmosphere that it could, you could say that it is racist because it's the community around her, not only her parents, but the community, the school, the society that makes this part of her norm. So in other words, you grow up in a form of racial thought, and it becomes almost like the air that you breathe. You don't know that it's racist. You don't know that it's demeaning. I know that I grew up in that kind of atmosphere, the kind of things that my parents, that my extended family members, that my community said, my friends, even things at church. These are the kind of things that you grow up and you parrot their attitudes, and sometimes the words, sometimes the very demeaning words, and you're not aware that this is insulting to anyone. And I think that that's where the power in this story comes from, the fact that Sarah doesn't know that what she's doing can be perceived by many as racist and insulting. And in fact, this hits home. I don't know if it necessarily hits home for Sarah, and I wanted to ask you that. Toward the end of the story, where her teacher takes her to the bathroom to wash off the charcoal, and as they're walking down the hall, they come across a young African-American student. A little girl is coming down the hall, and she looks at Sarah, and she has a curious look on her face. I don't know if it registers even then with Sarah that she's done something wrong. What do you think?
I didn't think that it registered at that point either, but again, we don't really have the benefit of knowing actually what's going on in that character's mind, which I think is a strength. Because I think it's left up to us to determine what Sarah is taking away from that encounter. But yeah, this is a very powerful story. This again was one of my favorite stories as well. And that Nate Powell mentions in this, and this kind of alludes to what we were talking about before about, you mentioned you're from North Carolina, Powell is from Arkansas, I'm from Mississippi. But in the introduction to this one, Powell says, as a Southerner, I'd always been told and believed that the South was the racist, backwards part of America. It wasn't until I moved to Indiana that I discovered just how much more messed up the Midwest often was than anywhere I'd lived in the South, specifically by virtue of its sameness, of white people often not having to deal with anyone outside their cultural echo chamber. So I think Powell addresses this issue of racism, no matter where you are. And I think that I don't know about you, Derek, but I've typically, when I run across somebody that's not from the South and they learn that I'm from the South, whether it's spoken or not, they tend to think, oh, well, is everyone there a racist? And I think one of the points Powell is making is racism, it cannot be confined to any one geographical place. It's everywhere, and it's not just in the United States. Sadly, it's everywhere, and it's something that every person has to deal with. And I think this story in microcosm deals with that very well.
Yeah, it does. And, he's right to point out, as well as what you've said, racism is everywhere. And you can go, American history is a history of racism throughout, regardless of whether it's in the South, and regardless of whether it is linked to African American or other ethnic or racial groups, or however we may define race. So there is that there. Although I do disagree with Powell a bit that it may be a little more, maybe in his experiences, it was a kind of a different intensity in Indiana, because I lived in Indiana for quite a number of years, and yeah, it's there as well. But there's something to me, and I am by no means a Southern apologist. I do sincerely believe that there is something inbred, and I don't mean that in a loaded way, in the South, when it comes to race, that it's something that can never be cleansed as much as we would like to think. And so maybe this is the Faulknerian part of me coming out here. But that even when it's not overt, and even when it doesn't have anything directly to do with race per se, it's still linked to race given the South's history with slavery. So, there's racism in Indiana. Yeah, there's racism in New York and Vermont, New Hampshire and California and whatnot. But again, those places do not have the history and the baggage that the South does. That it is never going to leave that. That's one of the tragedies of the South. And I think it's not just the South, but it's America's original sin, slavery.
Yeah, and there's a lot to what you said. And again, when people that are not from the South come and speak to me, and some of it I think is just curiosity. They want to say, what was it like growing up there? What was this like? What was that like? But I think you're right, Derek, that there's part of that will probably never leave the South just because of the history, and that's just. As Southerners, that's just part of things that we have to deal with. Yeah.
Another one of my favorite stories, and I'm wondering if it's one of yours, and this doesn't have anything to do with South, but this gets back to a part of the stories that you had mentioned, the punk element. Bets are off.
Yes, I like that one quite a bit.
Yes, and he tells us in the introduction to this story that what he uses as dialogue or as words in the story are lyrics from a song to the Pretty Girls Make Graves, the group Pretty Girls Make Graves, The Getaway. And he doesn't arrange the lyrics as they appear in the song, so he kind of moves things around, as he says. But he apparently uses, and I'm not familiar with this song, so I don't know, but I'm taking him at his word, that he uses the lyrics as the basis for the dialogue. And this is a story of two young people running away from home. It's as simple as that. And it's how he handles this and how he paces this story and how he uses the lyrics as his dialogue that is so effective.
Yeah, this is a wonderfully constructed story. And again, Derek, like you, I don't know the song, but I'm going to go to Spotify after we finish recording and look this up because it's very intriguing. And two, one of the things that makes it such an interesting story is quite a few panels have no text at all. Mm-hmm. And so when you do get a lyric, a song lyric, or a part of the song lyric, it gives it more impact because it's just not constant song lyrics and images. It's they're used very economically and very effectively.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple of other stories that are different in that they seem to be much more historically based than the others. And so you can see where something like history, I mean, it definitely impacts his work on March, and then the Silence of Our Friends as well. And the two that I'm thinking about is Like Hell I Will, mm-hmm. and then the other one is Conjurers. Now, with Like Hell I Will, the introduction to this is something as simple as the sentence, "Yes, it's all true," and that's all we get. And this takes place in, is it Tulsa?
Tulsa,
mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's about an incident where a young man, a store clerk, named Dick Rowland, he went up in an elevator, and the elevator operator was a 19-year-old white woman. And apparently he tripped, or there was some kind of accident or something, to where either she claimed or the people around her in the community helped her to claim that she was sexually assaulted. And what this ends up doing is causing some kind of race riot. But it's not the African American community in Tulsa that riots, it is the white community. And to call it a slaughter is not an understatement.
Mm. Yeah, it's quite, and it does bring to mind, like you said, it does bring to mind March, just because it does involve, a large scale situation where you've got people that are outraged at an event that has happened. It's very effectively done. There's not a lot of dialogue. In fact, there may not be any dialogue. Oh, there's some dialogue, mm-hmm. but it's mostly narration.
Yeah, and there was, up to how many people died in this massacre?
Yeah, the last part says the death toll varies from 300 to 3,000 or more.
I mean, okay, that's a wide variance.
Yeah, it's pretty wide.
Yeah, so now if you take that at the upper end, okay, let's say for argument's sake that it is 3,000, then let me ask you, had you heard about this?
I had not.
And I have not either. So let's just say for argument's sake, if this is 3,000 deaths, then why have we all heard about 9/11 and not learned about this? Mm. Because it has to do with race. Mm. And maybe I'm being cynical here. And, of course, it could be closer to 300. Who knows? But, if we don't have a toll, and there's a reason why we don't have any kind of sensible death toll, is because something like this was hushed up. And again, maybe the reason why we don't have this in our common historical awareness.
Yeah, it could be. Like I said, this was a situation or a part of history that I was not familiar with.
Yeah, and it takes place in, the first decade of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is a very rough story. But then the other one that's historically based, Conjurers, this is about power going up, electrical lines going up in a community. So or at least part of it is. And so we have a community that is on the cusp of technological changes. And then linked to that is the story of a more contemporary woman who is preparing dinner for her, I don't know if it's her husband or it's the significant other, but she breaks the news to him at the end that she's pregnant, and she's making a recipe that her great-grandmother had made, who was part of this community, who was just getting power at this point. So, I mean, there's a linking of generations, but to me, the historical part is, bringing electricity to this community and how things will change after this. So there's that kind of historical awareness. And I really enjoyed that story as well.
Yeah, I did too. there's so many great stories in here. I mean, there's not a bad one in the bunch. They're all they all have enough diversity to them that there's almost something for everybody, as it were. But then again, there's the Nate Powell style and artistic sense that connects them, obviously, all because they're all stories that he's done. But again, I think one of the great parts of this book is just seeing the development of an artist, of a storyteller, from those very early stories to even the newest, the unpublished one, that we get to see, such an overview and such an interesting overview, especially for the people that have read March, because that's probably the most widespread work that he's done so far, or at least is in the public eye, perhaps more than his others. So it's very interesting to read March and then go back and look at this and look at where he has come from.
Exactly. And in fact, you had mentioned this final story that was not previously published. And so this may be a great way of taking us out of You Don't Say, or ending on this. Mm-hmm. The title of this story is Havens Have Not. And he tells us in the introduction that this started as a sequence that he was going to include in Any Empire, but he decided to leave it out. And if you've read Any Empire and then read Havens Have Not, you can see that this makes sense because it deals with kids about the age as, the protagonist for the most part in Any Empire. And you also have a young person who is interested in not only reading but also creating comics, and that's something that you have in Any Empire as well. And as Nate Powell suggests, by ending the book this way, in many ways, it provides closure because it brings us back to the 4 earlier autobiographical stories where you do have a character, Nate, who has the same kind of life experiences and history as the real-life author-creator Nick Powell, who has an interest in creating comics. And so the protagonist in Havens Have Not, also loves to make comics. And so the last story not only links back to the earlier part of the book, but you can also see it as a parting love letter to comics.
Yeah. And this reminds me, Derek, of a book we talked of not too long ago, Palookaville 22, which has that wonderful section where Seth is talking about or showing us the story about what it was like for him to discover comics as a boy. Mm-hmm. So this really, I always like to read that type of thing to, people that are into the arts, what led them into the arts. And this is a really, really touching and personal look at exactly that, what drew Nate Powell into comics and what drives him to continue to make them.
Exactly. Well, Andy, before we get to the last 2 titles that we're going to be discussing, let's remind listeners that our sponsor, or one of our sponsors for this episode, is Audible. They're offering our listeners a free audiobook of your choice and a free 30-day trial membership. Just go to www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative and choose from over 180,000 audio programs. Download a title for free and start listening. It's that easy. Go to audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative and get started today.
Yes, indeed. That's a lot of titles to choose from.
Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, these next 2 titles are not going to be what you could choose from at Audible, but they're great nonetheless, and so you got to get these hard copies into your hand. And Andy and I are looking at 2 recent short works published through Nobrow. Lost Property by Andy Poyiadgi and Vacancy by Jen Lee. Now, these are both part of the 17 by 23 series. And if you remember last year, back in November, Andy, you and I did a publisher spotlight on Nobrow Press. And one of the titles that we looked at, Fish, was a part of that series as well. And I don't know about you, but before reading Fish before doing that publisher spotlight on Nobrow, I wasn't aware of the 17 by 23 series. Were you?
Well, in a way I was, in a way I wasn't, but and I'll explain that. But yeah, Derek is right. We did talk about Fish last year by Bianca Bagnarelli, and when we got that, I thought, this looks familiar, or I've seen this somewhere. And then I went into my local comic shop, Third Eye Comics in Annapolis, and I saw that where they had the rest of the Nobrow books, the hardcover Nobrow books, that they had a whole series of these essentially short stories as graphic novels, like Fish and like the two that we're going to talk about today. So these things have been around, Derek, for not that long, but a couple of years at least?
Yeah, for a few years, yeah.
Yeah. So I was not aware of them until we reviewed Fish, and then I went and saw that there were several of these.
Yeah, and in fact, if you look at the back cover, and in fact the books in the series are great. They're really nicely put together. They're not long at all. They're short stories. They're saddle stitched, but they have the French fold covers. And on the back, and they describe the series this way. And I want to share it with the listeners. It says, the 17 by 23 series is a graphic short story project designed to help talented young graphic novelists tell their stories in a manageable and economic format. The hope is that while the series encourages artists to write one-off stories, 17 by 23 can act as a springboard for more ambitious projects. And I think that is a wonderful series for young creators who are just starting off. And in fact, these are very affordable. In the United States, these issues sell for $5.95. They have the substance of, at least the substance of, a regular comic book, as you would get in the U.S. But it's, I think, a better put together book. It's definitely more substantial in terms of the cardboard that they use and the page quality and even the coloring in the printing. So, just for about $1 or $1.50 more than you usually pay for a regular American comic, you can get something that is at least as good as an individual comic, if not better. And plus, it's a one-off short story from Nobrow in their 17 by 23 series.
Yeah, and I think this is a great series, and I think this is a great way to do so many things. First of all, to support a publisher that really has come out with some really great stuff, Nobrow, and as you said, we've done a publisher spotlight on them before, but also to learn some new creators. I think some of the people that contribute to this 17 by 23 are I hate to call them up and coming, because some of them have done other work, but they may be people that most comics readers may not be aware of. Maybe they work in other mediums. Like our first one that we're going to take a look at, Lost Property, Andy Poyiadgi. It's Poyiadgi. So I've been pronouncing it Poyiadgi. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Andy. I really butchered that. But Poyiadgi
maybe we can ask Matt to write in and help us with the pronunciation of his name.
Matt, help us out here. But Poyiadgi is based in London, and he's a graphic author, it says in the front flap, and a filmmaker. So he's made several films. But he's also a comics artist, so we may not have actually known that much about him before. And but again, this is a great way to experience not only new stories but new creators.
Right, exactly. And in fact, the creators who work in the 17 by 23 series, and we should point out that it's called 17 by 23 because the books are 17 centimeters by 23 centimeters, thus the name of the series. But the creators are international. So, we mentioned last year, back in November, on our Nobrow show, discussing Bagnarelli's Fish. Now, she's Italian. Andy Poyiadgi is English. He's based out of London. And then the creator of Vacancy, the next one we're going to discuss, Jen Lee, is from the United States. And so this does have, even though Nobrow is an English-based publisher, they have offices in the U.S., but their scope is international, it seems.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, now with Lost Property, again, it's a short story, but I think that there's a lot packed into this. How would you set this up to a reader?
Well, there's really not a lot to say, and I don't mean to slight the issue because there's a lot of great stuff in the issue, and I really, really like it. But the story's basically a simple one. Mm-hmm. There's a mailman named Gerald, and he is delivering packages, mail, and he discovers one day that he is...
Oh, he lost his letter. He lost his letter opener.
Yeah, he lost his letter opener, and he stumbles across basically a lost and found shop.
Yeah, someone calls him and says, "Hey, someone brought your lost letter opener. It's at the lost and found shop. Come over and get it."
Mm-hmm. And without giving too much away, Gerald goes into this lost and found shop and he says, "Oh, thank you for the letter opener." And he looks around and he says, a lot of these items look very familiar. So the premise of the book, again, it's hard to talk about it without giving away the entire thing. But Gerald discovers that there are some other things that are his property as well that are in this lost and found.
In fact, it seems like everything that's in the lost and found, or at least in the archives, as they call it, downstairs, are only items from his youth or things that he has lost throughout his life. And this is not a spoiler because this is on the jacket. This is in the description of the book. And so there is something rather uncanny about this title in that it's a lost property office that seems to have accumulated Gerald's lost stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, the part that we don't want to spoil is what he does once he finds this shop. Right. And realizes that these are indeed all of his things that he's lost throughout his life. He does say to the woman who manages this shop, the lost property shop, that when he was younger, he had wanted to be an artist, a sculptor, but he never followed up that dream, and now he thinks that it's too late for him to go in that artistic direction. So that's the premise that we have in Lost Property. And I think you're right. It is a simple story, and I don't mean simple in a negative or a pejorative sense. And I think its simplicity, it's one of its charms. And in fact, I don't often use the word charming in life in general, and especially when it comes to comics. But there is something very charming about Lost Property, don't you think?
I do, and it does have a lot of charm, like you said. I think it's also one of these, and again, these are terms I hate to use too, but it's also kind of a life-changing and life-affirming story as well. And again, those words can be just as trite as they can be, but it really. I think those terms really do describe what we have in Lost Property. It kind of reminds you of one of those Twilight Zone episodes that's just a little bit weird, but has enough of its footing in the real world for you to be able to relate to it. And there's so much in here. It's like everything that you ever had in your life. Maybe, I mean, we've all had things that we've lost and we wish we could get them back. We misplace things. And this story is the kind of what if everything you ever lost in your life was kept somewhere and you could find it. And it's like everything in your life has a reason and a purpose if you can just make it all fit somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And, I hadn't thought of this before you mentioned it just a second ago, but this is like a Twilight Zone episode because it has the uncanny premise, which is, based on the question, what if there were a place that had all the things that you had lost throughout your life? What would that mean? But it's just enough of a strange premise to take it into different and, as you put it, life-affirming. And you're right, words like terms like life-affirming and charming can get a little cheesy and sappy and overused. But I think they are used correctly and appropriately for Lost Property. There is something very nice about this story. But you're right. This could have made a great Twilight Zone episode.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, too, that I like, and No Brow really, really excels at the way they print color. I think we spoke about it before, the process they use, and I can't really get into the technical details because I don't understand them. But they do have a unique way of separating colors, and this book really, really brings that out really well. You can tell that most of Gerald's normal world is the town that he's in is a fairly colorful town. But when we look at his apartment at the clothes that he wears. They're just kind of this, institutional green. It's not very exciting. It's not very colorful at all. And we see the same thing when we get to the lost properties, the lost and found. The walls itself are pretty much, again, that institutional green. But it's the things that are in there that are colorful, with the parts of his life that have gone missing, that are vibrant with color. And I think this is really, really effectively done by Poyiadgi and the editors at Nobrow.
Exactly, and it's what Gerald ends up doing with those everyday items from his life and transforming them into something wholly other that we won't give away. But it does have a very nice ending to it.
Mm-hmm. And Derek, I was thinking too that if you have someone in your life that means something to you, or a friend or a coworker that doesn't like comics or graphic novels, and that, this would actually be a pretty good gift to give them, because it's very approachable. Again, enough of it is grounded in the real world that they might appreciate it. And again, like we said, even though we don't like the term life-changing and life-affirming, it has enough of those qualities in it that somebody that's not used to comics might really gravitate towards this.
Mm-hmm. Plus, it's very affordable.
Yep.
Yeah, as all in the 17 by 23 series books are. Well, what about the other one that we're discussing in that series, Vacancy by Jen Lee?
Vacancy is a very different story from Lost Property. Again, it has a lot of the wonderful colors, but used in a different way. This is about a dog named Simon. And Simon basically is confined to the backyard of his owner's home. And unfortunately, he's pretty much neglected by his owners. And Simon's trying to think about how he could break away and just be free from all of the drudgery that his life normally is. And he happens upon a raccoon and a deer who take him into the woods where he has an adventure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, again, this sounds like a cliche, but Simon literally hears the call of the wild.
Yes.
He's in his fenced backyard, and at one point he hears animals outside going, "Arr, arr," and he wants to be a part of that. He says at one point when he hears that, in fact, Simon wears glasses, okay, so that makes him much more domesticated, or gives him, as a dog, a more domesticated look. And at this point, when he hears the howling at night, he takes off his glasses and says, "I'll mark trees with you soon, my Yote brothers." And that's both touching and hilarious, because Simon does romanticize the wild, and as we find in the description of this book on the inside cover, again on the French flap, once he gets outside of his safe domestic world, things aren't as safe and as assured as he would guess that they would be. And so this is a story of, learning, be careful for what you wish for, because he does get what he wishes for, to be out in the wild. And he is among, the raccoon and the deer. And, they're very much like he is, even though these are wild creatures, they're also prey.
Right.
And they're chased by, I guess they're dogs. They could be wolves, for all we know, that come in the last half of the story, and they chase them back into the suburbs, which, this pack will not pursue them into the boundaries of the suburbs, because, this is where it becomes dangerous for them, the wild pack. So there is a return, there's departure and a return for Simon. Now, I don't know how much to get into this or not, but I'm very, very curious about the ending. And it's ambiguous enough to where I don't think we could give anything away if we wanted to, but I still don't know how much to say about this.
I'm kind of scratching my head about the ending as well. I'm not really sure, and you're right, Derek. I think it's purposefully meant to be ambiguous, but yeah, it's one of those endings you have to just kind of look at and think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, again, I don't want to give too much away, but I think it's enough to say that, Simon, along with his new companions, the raccoon and the deer, they return back to Simon's house. They're in the backyard, and we're not sure, though, at the end, if Simon is back in the same situation that he was, meaning fenced in and by himself, or if there's something else going on. And it's just ambiguous enough to end nicely for me. I love ambiguity. I don't like stories that are nice and neatly tied up. That being said, I do think that Lost Property was tied up fairly well. Didn't have much ambiguity there, but I love that ending also.
I loved it too, and I also love the humor that the book has. It's kind
Vacancy?
of yeah. It's got a lot of humor to it, and I don't know about you, Derek, but it really reminded me of Fantastic Mr. Fox, the Wes Anderson film.
I have not seen that.
Oh wow, you got to see that. It's got a lot of that humor that's just it's just at the right time, and it goes on just long enough. And there's a really great scene early where Simon is trying to get these guys to accept him, to take him in the wild, and he says, "Take me. I need someone to show me the ropes of the wild." And they go, and he says, "Hear me out. I got something to offer. I was bred for protection. I have all the assets lesser mammals like yourselves need." And then there's this great shot, and he says, "Teeth?" And he's actually pulling his gums apart and pointing to his teeth. And he says, "Agile limbs," and he's got like the skinniest legs of any animal that you ever saw. And then he looks at him and says, "Well, fellas." So there's a lot of really highly comedic moments, and just maybe not highly comedic, but just the right amount of humor in the book that you laugh, and then you want to see what Simon's going to, if these guys are going to accept Simon or if they're just going to diss him or what.
Yeah, and they do seem to accept him.
Yeah.
I don't think they make fun of him once they get into the woods, nor do they try to do things that will frustrate him. I mean, because at one point they're hungry, and Simon mentions, "Boy, I need something to eat," and the raccoon sees something on the ground. He said, "Hey, Simon, found some prime protein for you."
Yeah.
Some sucker left behind this fine morsel, and it looks like a drumstick, I guess, because of the bone that someone just kind of dumped there, or it could be like a rotting part of an animal. I don't know. And Simon picks it up, takes a big gnaw at the meat that's left there, and then throws up. And then the deer admonishes the raccoon. He says, "What'd you feed him that trash meat? We can't lose him here. We're in deep pred territory." And then the raccoon says, "I'm teaching him that you got to eat anything to survive," which is actually what a raccoon does.
Right. Yeah.
But a deer doesn't, so the deer is saying, "What are you giving that trash meat for?"
Yeah.
So little things like that. And that gets back to what you had mentioned in terms of the humor.
Mm-hmm. And too, that Jen Lee is having a lot of fun with this story, but at the same time, I think she's probably making some interesting points about animal living conditions, but also maybe human living conditions. Because as they travel through the woods, there's a scene where they're, as you said, they go back to the home, but they go through the town, and the town is pretty much just a wasted. It looks like a dilapidated, land that time forgot almost. Nothing is modern. Nothing is well kept at all. So you wonder really what Jen Lee is telling us about the surroundings here. And again, are animal stories more about the animals or more about the humans?
Exactly. And in fact, when they go back to the town, and this is apparently the community that Simon's from, I mean, it looks like a war zone.
Yeah.
It looks like a town that had suffered the kind of upheavals that you find, let's say, in The Walking Dead. And we never see any humans. And in fact, when we return to Simon's house, before we had seen just the backyard, the fenced-in backyard, but they go into the house, and his house looks like part of that war zone as well, broken windows and all, which leads me to believe that his owners didn't forget him; they left him.
Right.
I mean, that seems to be the insinuation, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's definitely that theme of abandonment, and how you deal with that. So there's a lot of stuff here. I mean, it's on the surface, it's a really fun, entertaining story about these animals, but I think there's something more substantial underneath.
Yeah, and when we were talking about the ambiguity underlining the last page, I think that brings home that theme or potential theme of abandonment.
Yeah, I think so.
So, Andy, those are two new titles in No Brow's 17 by 23 series, Lost Property by Andy Poyiadgi and Vacancy by Jen Lee. And then before that, we looked at Ryan K. Lindsay's and Eric Zawadzki's Headspace from IDW, and then from Top Shelf, Nate Powell's latest story collection, You Don't Say. So a lot of good reading for this week.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff.
Yep. So we hope that you got a lot out of this, and if you were not familiar with these titles, that you run out and get them. And in fact, if you're going to get your comics, you can't do any better than going to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. That's the greatest place that you can find pre-order comics. So they have great deals. You can't go wrong with them. Or if you're looking for titles that are already out, so for instance, Headspace and You Don't Say, as well as the 17 by 23 series. I'm not sure if they have those, but it's worth checking out. You can go to the sister company of DCB Service, and that is In Stock Trades. InStockTrades.com or DCBService.com. Either way, you can't lose. Great deals, great comics.
That is right.
And then after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. Go to the website, comicsalternative.com, and in the right side of your browser, you will find a Send Voicemail tab. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can leave us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's just that simple. Or if you want to do it the difficult way, call us on the telephone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you would like to find out about the latest news and the things that we're podcasting and adding to the blog, you can check us out on Twitter. We are at 2 Guys with PhDs, and we appreciate you favoring our tweets and retweeting our tweets.
That's right, and that's the number 2 Guys with PhDs. But if you want to email us, you spell out TWO guys at comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly at Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy, how to get in touch with you directly?
You can get in touch with me at Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, and on Instagram and Google+. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our episodes of the podcast, as well as a list of reviews and comics-related commentary that we put up on the blog, and that's at comicsalternative.com.
Yep. Lots of ways to find out what we're doing.
That's right. And I think I announced this last week, Andy, but we now have a vibrant YouTube channel. So if you want to go to our YouTube page and get the Comics Alternative that way, it is www.youtube.com/C/Comics Alternative. And we have the episodes from the last 2 months up, and from here on in, we'll be publishing on YouTube every new episode of the Comics Alternative after we put up the podcast episode. And we're doing that because I know that there are a lot of people who consume their media primarily through YouTube, primarily videos, but also some audio. Now, we don't have at least an animated visual presence on YouTube. It's just the cover album of a particular episode, but you could listen to the podcast through YouTube. So whether you go through our website or through iTunes or Stitcher or now through YouTube, it's all good as long as you listen to the podcast.
That's right. There's so many different ways to get to it, and we hope you'll choose one or more.
Yep. And we hope that you will get in touch with us and let us know what you like about our episodes. Let us hear from you. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.
This has been a Filmways presentation, darling.